Hello and welcome. 2024 is one of the most politically consequential years for several decades. Not till the year 2048 will the world see the number of elections that we're going to witness this year. To get a sense of the stakes for the global order, we're joined at the India Today studios here at the World Economic Forum in Davos by one of the world's sharpest foreign affairs thinkers. Zakaria is back with us at India Today. Thank you so much and welcome.
Always a pleasure, Rahul.
It's terrific to have you with us and superb way of getting the WEF week started for us. I want to start by asking you about your big concern for 2024. When you look at this year, we're reading some people say this is the most consequential political year in many of our careers. What's the most important thing you're looking out for this year, Farid?
Well, unfortunately, I have to confess, Rahul, that the biggest challenge of 2024 is going to come not from an election in some third world country, that's battered and dysfunctional. It's going to come from the American elections. Because it is in many ways a pivotal election, because Donald Trump has a very good chance of winning. And the reason I think that people should understand the stakes is that I know sometimes there are people in India who find Trump fascinating and even admirable because he's funny and he's clever and he's charming and he has a certain kind of populist flair that in some ways some Indians like. The big danger of Trump, I think, actually globally, is that he fundamentally wants to withdraw America from the world. He wants to essentially turn his back on a role that America has played in the world since 1945 as the ultimate guarantor of security in Europe, as the ultimate guarantor of security in Asia. If he does that, I think you are going to see very, very large consequences. Look at the Middle East, to give you an example. Why is the Middle East in flames? The Middle East is in flames right now because the United States over the last 15 years has been withdrawing from there. And instead of arriving at some wonderful, stable balance, the horrible imperialist is gone, actually what's happened is a power vacuum has developed in the Middle East. Regional players are jockeying for influence, largely Iran versus Saudi Arabia. In the midst of all that contest, Iran pressing forward through the Houthis, through Hamas, through Hezbollah, through the Iraqi militias, the Israelis got rattled. The Gulf Arabs got rattled. They got together. That then outraged the Palestinians who and Hamas blew the whole thing up. So you see how the withdrawal of American power leads to an enormous amount of geopolitical tension, jockeying for power. Now imagine that happening on a larger scale in Asia, where there are 7 or 8 very powerful countries all jockeying for influence. That's why I worry. The United States has been playing a role of stabilizing the world. If Trump pulls us out from that, it will be 2025 onwards, it'll be a hell of a ride.
In your response, it seems that you almost believe that it is inevitable that Trump will be on the Republican ticket. Is that the way that you're seeing it? Because I was chatting yesterday with the chief executive of the Atlantic Council, and he said maybe because of all the court cases, Trump might still get tripped over and may not be the Republican nominee. Or do you think that's highly unlikely now?
So first we have to say, the media likes a race, as you know. There isn't a race. Trump is 30 points ahead of his nearest rival. If you look at the Iowa caucuses, he's at 50. Nikki Haley's at 25 or something like that. It just doesn't say. I've never seen somebody with a lead like this. There was a very interesting story in the New York Times today about how Trump has now regained his entire lead with college-educated Republicans, whom he had lost in 2020. And that's why he lost to Biden.
Why do you think that's happening? Young Americans, educated Americans, wanting to root for Trump?
I think that there is a very large part of America that feels that their voice is not heard, that they are rural, they are less educated, they may be some college educated, but they'll tend to have gone to, colleges that are a little bit outside the mainstream, more religious, more white. That's the profile of the Trump voter. And these people feel that they have been ignored, disrespected, particularly religious people. Now, why they have chosen Trump as their standard bearer, 3 times, 4 times divorced. I can't even count a man who's obviously never read the Bible in his life. But I think they see him as a fighter, and they see him as somebody who, at the end of the day, knows the system and is as crooked as everybody else. There's a certain sense in which ye hamara chor hai. So there's a way in which that even appeals to them, so that's the popularity. The court cases, first of all, fuel his popularity because they convince his supporters that people are trying to throw this guy in jail. People are trying to get him off the ballot. American people should have a choice. This shouldn't be decided by courts and prosecutors. But more broadly, I think, he's part of a wave of populism everywhere.
So, Trump versus Biden contest, do you think it's more likely now, from what we know and the polling that we're seeing, that Trump might prevail?
It's very close. Remember, Biden won last time by 7 million votes. My guess is he'll win by 9 million votes this time. But that's the national vote. That's not the Electoral College. What happens in these 3 or 4 states with a few 100,000 voters? I still think that if you forced me to do an analysis, I would say that Biden will probably squeak by because those people will come home. Those younger voters, those college-educated voters who have been voting Democratic in state elections. The Democrats have done pretty well over the last 2 or 3 years. But it's a very close call.
But they may not be enthused to go out and vote
exactly.
for Biden.
And because of the Gaza war, because of who knows what, that Biden has a health problem. The idea that the fate of the world depends on a few 100,000 voters in 4 states in the United States is scary, but that is true.
Do you think the Democrats should have pushed harder to ensure that Biden stayed a one-term president? Everybody just kind of sat by and let Biden want to contest again.
Look, this part will be familiar to Indians. There is no Democratic Party in that sense. The president is the head of the party. It's become a very personality-oriented political organization on both sides. I mean, in Trump's case, it's become a family cult. I mean, the last Republican convention, 5 of his 5 members of the Trump family spoke in primetime slots. There is no party left. There is no equivalent of the Congress Working Committee as there used to be in the old days, just as there really isn't in Congress or BJP anymore. It's all what the top guy says. Biden says he doesn't want to leave. Everyone salutes and gets in line. But I do think it is Biden should have thought much harder about whether or not this is the responsible thing to do. He's been a good president, but can you be a good president when your next term is going to be years 82 to 86? I mean, we all know 80-year-olds. It's a very different level of energy.
There's a very consequential election in the United States, and Prime Minister Modi will be fighting to win a 3rd term. What's your reading, Fareed, of Prime Minister Modi's re-election prospects and all that's playing out in India at the moment?
Look, they're very bright. Objectively, Modi is in a commanding position. I think he probably is in the most commanding position in all these elections you're talking about around the world. Modi is probably in the most commanding position. Why? India is doing well. Some of that is Modi and his policies, and you have to give him credit for that. Some of it is 20 years of reforms that have created a certain momentum that is now unstoppable. And I do think poor Manmohan Singh deserves a lot more credit for all that than he gets. Some of it is the BJP's organization is just much, much better than the opposition. The fundraising, they are, maybe 100 times more money than their opponents in some parts of the country. And Modi is very charismatic. He has, again, this is part of this new phenomenon. Modi has his pulse on a certain kind of Indian in a way that very few people have in India. He comes from outside the elite. He may be the first real non-elitist Indian Prime Minister. If you think of the Nehru, Gandhi, even Narasimha Rao, even Manmohan Singh, they all, by education, if not birth, came out of a certain kind of elite background. He doesn't. And there is a sense in which the Aam Aadmi is relates to him, and he understands Hindu pride. the ordinary Hindu's pride in a way. I wish he would use it in a more positive way, not to divide people, but to bring everyone up. But there's no question that he has tapped into something.
But Prime Minister Modi seems to be defying a global trend against anti-incumbency. World over, whether it is Biden, Macron, Trudeau in Canada, they're all facing massive anti-incumbency. He seems to be the one outlier in a country as complex as India.
Because he has managed to be both an incumbent and part of the establishment, and yet the populist outsider. That's what I mean by the tapping into this Hindu pride. He is able to tap into the pride of a large part of India that felt that, we're not Bombay walas, we're not Delhi walas, we didn't go to these fancy universities, but our time has come. And we don't speak a Hindustani with English words thrown in. We speak, Kattar Hindi, we may even speak dialects, Brijbhashan, whatever. That India Modi gets. And so he's simultaneously able to be the outsider and the insider. Erdogan in Turkey is the closest example. Orban in Hungary. There are a few of these characters, and Modi is, I think, probably the leading one among them.
Now, there's a massive Pran Pratishtha happening at Ayodhya on the 22nd of January, and all of India is agog. And I'm quite shocked by the number of young people who suddenly seem to be discovering a level of religiosity which they didn't seem to demonstrate previously. From your perch, what do you make of this? Ram bhajans are flying off Spotify, of Ghana, Apple Music. It's the hottest genre of music in India at this moment.
Look, India has always been a traditional society. If you look at the kind of, Pew surveys of world values, it's a traditional society. It's a religious society. It's in many ways still remains a very patriarchal society. Women's participation in the labor force in India is lower than in Saudi Arabia. What is that about? That's about a very traditional home structure. So it doesn't surprise me at some level. What has happened is that this has been encouraged, politicized, even weaponized. Some of the encouragement, some of the celebration is great. It's one wonderful thing that people should take greater pride in their religion, in their culture, in their... Again, as I always say, to me, the task of leadership is to find a way for people to take pride in themselves without putting other people down, without saying that this is my pride comes at your fall, at your expense. And that I fear the BJP does not do. The BJP, clearly it is part of a political project to make Indian Muslims feel like second-class citizens. That's unfortunate because I think the greatness of Hinduism has always been its incredible pluralism and tolerance. I mean, Hinduism is the most tolerant religion in the world. You can be vegetarian or non-vegetarian. You can believe in one god or three gods or 100. You can, there's so many of these passages in the Rig Veda which are extraordinary in their generosity of spirit, and that I fear is missing. So while I'm delighted and I feel a certain Indian pride in seeing that. That kind of outpouring of positive sentiment. I just hope it can be channeled in the direction of unifying the country rather than dividing
You
it.
mentioned Erdogan in Turkey. He too was up against a combined opposition, 6 parties coming together. They fell short. They made it a tighter contest, but fell short by about 6% votes. In a global context, what's your sense of the prospects of the India alliance as parties like the Trinamool, the Samajwadi Party, the Congress all try and come together? This experiment hasn't really succeeded against a towering personality like a Prime Minister Modi in other countries where it's been attempted.
So it's very hard. You need another towering personality. The biggest problem for Turkey was they didn't have... Erdogan is a huge, larger-than-life figure, and they had nobody like that. So the question is, does the opposition have somebody like that? And then the second part is, are they willing to be truly, brutally strategic? Are they willing to put up in every constituency in India one BJP candidate versus one opposition candidate? So the opposition would have to combine around the strongest person in that particular constituency, regardless of what that meant for their party. That's the smart thing to do. Will they do that? I don't know. But look, the math, as you know, the mathematics are, last time around, the BJP won 38% of the vote and got 62% of the seats. Why? because the opposition was divided. If you confronted the country with one opposition candidate versus one BJP candidate and the strongest opposition candidate, I think they would have a very good shot at a much better showing.
What does a potential third term for Prime Minister Modi look like from your lens? Where do you see the third term of the BJP government taking India?
So I hope for three things really. One is the solidifying of India's reforms. There are still areas where India is still a very difficult place to do business by global standards. It's very protectionist. Labor laws are very tough. Land acquisition is tough. Modi tried to do something about some of those things. Maybe the third term will allow him to just create, and it's really the people need to understand, when you talk about reforms like this, it's all to help the average person. Because the big conglomerates and the big houses, they love having these complicated regulations and tariffs. It protects them from foreign competition. It protects them from domestic competition. They can manipulate the system. The more you open the economy up, the more the average person benefits, the more the small entrepreneur benefits. So one thing would be to really try and create a more of a level playing field in the Indian economy. The second is solidify the alliance with the United States. I strongly believe that it is in India's strategic interest not to be sitting on the fence, not to be playing footsie with the Russians. India would benefit dramatically by having a generational alliance with America. It doesn't have to be formal. I don't mean that. What I mean is a generational level of commitment that there's going to be cooperation, dialogue, cross-fertilization of economics, trade, technology, education. Remember,
But that's already happening, isn't it?
it's not happening. I mean, you take something like education. I was on the Yale board, so I know this a little bit. We tried desperately to do more in India. It's incredibly hard. India has so many backward colonial, post-colonial regulations that are so suspicious of foreign universities, so suspicious of foreign NGOs. What's happening, honestly, Rahul, is at a chattering class level, there's a lot of people, CEOs going back and forth, praising each other. What needs to happen is actual institutionalized people-to-people exchanges. Tariffs are still very high. India is the most protectionist large economy in the world. So all that needs to change. And then finally, I would hope he would unify the country. I think he has a real chance to go down. Look, he has a chance to go down as the most important Indian Prime Minister since Nehru. I think it would be hard for him to overtake Nehru because Nehru was India's first Prime Minister. And that gives him a kind of unique status as the man who established modern India and particularly modern Indian democracy. But he has the chance to leave a very powerful legacy.
But in a global context, if you go back in time as well, where does Modi stand in the pantheon of global leaders going back in history?
So Modi has to, that's where I think that Modi so far has played his hand well. He's shrewd. He manages to take advantage of situations well. He gets on well with other leaders. But what is his vision for India? Where does he want India to go? Where does he want it to be? And what I'm saying is I think India's destiny lies in being at the forefront of the democratic world, of the world of order, not disorder, of the world of a rules-based international system, of open societies, open politics, open economics. That is where, there needs to be a greater push in that direction. It can't just be that you play your hand well, that that doesn't put you in a pantheon. The people who are in the pantheon have vision.
Okay, let's switch for a moment to the Israel-Hamas conflict. And I want you to share with everyone watching at this time your perspective on the prospects for escalation. We are hearing from, they're very rational players at play here, and they'll find a way of ensuring that there is no further escalation. To the other side of the spectrum, which seems to believe that escalation now is inevitable.
I don't think it's inevitable. I don't think it's inevitable, but I'm very worried. Look, Hezbollah and Iran have generally been fairly careful, cautious players. What they do cleverly and surreptitiously and under the table. They don't do it overtly. But you are getting to a level of tit-for-tat violence where a miscalculation, a misperception could easily take things one step further. And most worrying, these attacks that are taking place where the Houthis are attacking commercial shipping, and then the Americans and the Brits are going and attacking the Houthis. This has a very dangerous feel to it, because I understand that the impulse. The United States, again, is trying to act as the kind of global policeman and say, look, you can't stop all global trade that goes into the Red Sea. That is, that's one of the two vital choke points of traffic in the world. I mean, India's energy comes from there. On the other hand, to get into a tit for tat with the Houthis just feels like you're going down a dark path. The Saudi Arabians went down that path for 10 years. They bombed the Houthis. They got the UAE involved. And those guys, these are classic terrorist militia bandits. They always live to fight another day. They're launching asymmetrical operations. U.S. says we're going to destroy their capacity to wreak terror. I mean, what their capacity? You're talking about $2,000 drones, maybe sometimes $500 drones that are being launched, using an iPhone. How are you going to stop people from doing this? So, it's a dilemma. I understand why the U.S. is doing what it's doing, but I'm very worried that it can easily, it can get to a point where the U.S. feels like it's not winning, so now it has to do more. And then the Houthis keep surviving, and then the U.S. keeps doing more. And where do we go from there? The U.S. will have gotten itself involved in a war in the Middle East, where at the same time it's involved in a war in Ukraine.
So we'll come to Ukraine in a moment. How long do you see the Israel-Hamas war go on for? It almost seems as if Benjamin Netanyahu wants this war to go on for as long as possible. And the U.S., even though they're making the kind of noises that they are, aren't bearing down to get him to stop.
I agree. I think Netanyahu may even benefit from the war expanding, because it becomes more complicated, more dangerous, not a time at which you can have a change of government, not a time at which you can have elections. It's a very cynical strategy that Netanyahu is employing. What should happen is there should be a cessation, largely of military operations in Gaza. Look, they've destroyed 70% of all the buildings in northern Gaza. How much more can you destroy? What they really should have done from the start was targeted operations at the leadership, whether they're in Lebanon or not. Go after each one, hunt them down, kill them. That's what's going to have an effect on Hamas. Destroying the entire infrastructure of Gaza actually benefits Hamas, because it radicalizes the population. For every neighborhood you destroy, surely you're going to have created a couple of hundred radicalized people. So the whole strategy seems to me misguided. They should stop. They should have a ceasefire. They should go after the Hamas people in a more targeted way. But will they? No. I mean, I think that they say they're going to de-escalate, but I suspect that this will go on for a while, because it's not in the Israeli government's interests. It's not in the Prime Minister's interest to end it.
Now, 83 national security advisors were in Davos to talk about a potential Ukrainian peace plan. It seems Vladimir Zelensky is getting increasingly frustrated with the fact that the world's attention is now divided because of the Israel-Hamas conflict, and because he's not getting the kind of aid that he wanted to. How do you see the Russia-Ukraine conflict play out this year?
Look, the problem with the argument for a peace plan is very simple. The Russians are not willing to negotiate right now. Russia has made a strategic decision that it is going to hang in there. It is going to, it's doing pretty well this year. It is going to try and press its advantage. It's going to resupply itself and wait for the 2024 election. Again, we get back to that pivotal election. It's absolutely clear the Russians feel if Trump wins, he'll sell the Ukrainians down.
Will he do that? What's your sense?
You can never tell with Trump, because he's such an... it's such a personalized, narcissistic foreign policy that it'll depend on whether he thinks he will look good one way or the other. So I think we can't actually tell, but I think Putin thinks he could make a deal with Trump. They know each other. We know this, that Trump admires Putin enormously. So that is the great concern, which is you're not going to get a deal this year while the Russians are waiting. But I do think that as a broader proposition, we should be thinking about a negotiated end to this war. Look, at the end of the day, Ukraine's goal should not be to recover every last square inch of territory. Ukraine's goal should be to create for itself the ability to exist as an independent, sovereign country anchored in the West, anchored in Europe, with security guarantees and membership in the European Union. You can have that whether you have 85% of Ukraine or 97% of Ukraine. Does it matter that South Korea, lost half its territory when, not half, it lost a certain amount of its territory? Does it matter that, there's so many countries in the world where the size of your territory is not what's important. What's important is what you do with it, how you invest in it. So if the Ukrainians can get EU membership, security guarantees, stable borders, that part can remain frozen and contested, and you move on.
Last year I asked you if there could be a palace coup against Putin. That's when there were some kind of coups against Putin, and he seemed to be on a sticky wicket. This year the question is, can Putin win?
Well, and if you recall, I told you there was no chance, and I think that has turned out to be right. I don't think Putin can win unless the West completely abandons Ukraine, because the Ukrainians will fight. And you have to understand this. The Ukrainian attitude is the attitude of a colonized people who want to fight for their independence. So, the French tried to stay in Algeria. A lot of people said, the Algerians won't keep fighting. The French had killed 1 million Algerians over 15 years. The Algerians kept fighting. The Ukrainians will keep fighting. But it can get very bloody and very messy, and you could have a lot of Ukrainian death if the West does not supply them. I hope the West does supply them, because I think you want to combat this kind of aggression. You want to give it's important to remember, this is classic 19th century aggression where you are invading another country, taking its territory, taking its people, making that part of your country. And that has really not happened that much since 1945. It is a very rare case of classic aggression. And so I hope the West counters it.
In the last part of this conversation, I want to talk about China. China and the US seem to be pulling back from the kind of increasing confrontation. How do you see that relationship play itself out? And how do you see Xi Jinping deal with India and Prime Minister Modi's government?
So you're right. China is being much more sensible with regard to its foreign policy, much less aggressive with the US. There is an effort to create a working relationship. The US has also in some way reached out more than they had in the past. The fundamental question Xi Jinping faces is not how he'll deal with the US, because the US is so powerful. At some level, you knew there was going to be some kind of rationality would step in at some point. The question is, how will he deal with India, with Japan, with Australia? Because the key that we have to remember about China is this is all not just about America. It's that China's rise has caused great nervousness and anxiety and opposition in Japan, in India, in Vietnam, in South Korea, in Australia, in the Philippines. And Xi has not been a particularly good foreign policy president in that sense. He has managed to alienate almost all these countries. So if Xi is able to genuinely adjust course, that would be one thing. But I think Xi is much more ideological than people realize. Look at the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is doing very badly after 40 years of extraordinary success. China's technocrats know what to do. They have handled these crises in the past expertly. China has grown at a pace no country in the world has ever grown. And yet they are not doing it. Why? Because Xi Jinping doesn't believe in those technocrats. He doesn't believe in the market-oriented way they handle things. He doesn't believe in, easing up the economy, allowing consumers to spend more, giving easy credit. He thinks this is all soft, weak. He gave a speech to young people that's very telling. Young people have, by some measures, 35, 40, 45% unemployment. And he gives a speech to these young people saying, you have it too easy. When I was growing up, we were sent into the farms of the Cultural Revolution. You need to suffer. You need to struggle. That's what will build your character. So that's a very different approach, you know. So she may be much more ideological.
But how's he most likely to deal with India from where we are at this moment? Because he boycotted or didn't come to the G20 in India, Prime Minister Modi, and she hardly met, just a very curtsy handshake. And the armies are still deployed in some areas, eyeball to eyeball, along the line of actual control.
So what he should do, if he was smart, is the most important relationship in the world for China should be India. Because if he can defang India and defang India's opposition to him, the American alliance in Asia becomes much less potent. Because otherwise, you're dealing with offshore countries. India is the only major land power.
But he seems to be playing to a different tune.
He's playing to a different tune. He is not taking any real steps. I mean, what has he gained from that Himalayan excursion? 40 miles of glaciers, and in return, he completely changed the Indian attitude towards China. So I suspect that tensions will continue. I don't see any particular rapprochement unless you see a real de-escalation, and it would have to start with that border. I think for India, understandably, the symbol of China's commitment to a different relationship would be not just de-escalation from the border, but the destruction of infrastructure that has been built at the border. Because you can't just withdraw your troops and keep in place the whole infrastructure there, which can allow them to surge forward at any moment.
But there's no sign of that. Far from, they're building new villages, they're building more roadways, they're building more military infrastructure. So what do you think could be going on in the mind of Xi Jinping and the generals in the PLA? Where are they going with this?
Look, it seems that this Chinese leadership has an obsession with the idea of demonstrating to India that it is the older brother. If you remember, that was the phrase that used to be used in the 60s after the 62 war, where that the Chinese wanted to show the Indians that they were, superior. They were the more powerful country. They were the leading power of Asia. And maybe that is the dynamic here, because, as I say, it makes no rational sense. China should be trying to play the US and India, put a wedge between them. There are 16 borders China has. It has resolved 15 of them, largely. This is the 16th, and they show no signs of wanting to resolve it. You have to assume it is because they have a strategic desire to maintain a certain kind of, as you know, that area is sensitive because there is a potential, there's a way in which you can create a kind of stranglehold, a choke point for India, over India. And maybe they want to do that.
Lastly, on Taiwan, on the back of the presidential elections, where an anti-China party has won yet again, do you see Xi Jinping getting more belligerent on Taiwan, given where they've already upped the ante to?
So it will again be an interesting example of whether he can show some maturity. Yes, an anti-China party did win, but the guy won with 40% of the vote. That means 60% of the vote went to the other two candidates who were not as anti-China. They were not pro-China, but they were moderates on this issue. So what he should realize is that Taiwan, really the main sentiment in Taiwan is not in favor of independence. It's in favor of the status quo. Continue the status quo, let us live with de facto independence. That seems to be the solution to the Taiwan problem, if there is a solution, which is everyone can have their fantasies about the future, but nobody changes anything in the present.
No, but what happens if Trump gets elected? Does that then change the equation completely in Asia Pacific?
On this issue, Trump has not been particularly irresponsible. So one has to hope that it doesn't change too much. He has tried to play around a little bit with being more pro-Taiwan. But no, I think the ball is in Beijing's court. Beijing could keep if you're willing to kick the can down the road, and I think that is the best solution to Taiwan. Sometimes there are problems in the world that cannot be solved perfectly, they can be managed. And the best way to manage this is for everybody to just accept the status quo is fine and we don't want to disturb it.
We'll leave it there for the time being. This has been a fascinating conversation with lots of very sharp and unique insights as always. Thank you very much.
Pleasure, Rahul.
Thank you. Thank you.